Studios, I'm Jared, and this is the BFIBs Almanac. On this episode, I'm going to get into, is there such a thing as clutch? Clutch hitting, clutch pitching, clutch performances. Is it real? Before we get into that, I want to invite you to get a hold of us on Twitter and Instagram at BFIBs Almanac. You can email us at bfibsalmanac@gmail.com. Subscribe to the podcast on all your favorite podcast apps, iTunes, Stitcher, whatever. Tell your friends, tell your family, tell your coworkers, tell strangers on the streets. Check out BFIBs Almanac. All right, let's get into what is clutch. Is it a real thing? First, I think we need to decide on a definition, and that's part of the issue a lot of people have is agreeing on what clutch is. Is it performing better in pressure situations? Is it performing, not performing worse in those same types of situations? Is performing worse real, or is it just generally tougher competition in, say, in the playoffs? Is it just that you're facing a better pitcher, or, are pitchers facing better hitters? So, is it something that we kind of forget when a player strikes out or grounds out? You move on to the next batter or the next at bat. So you don't really you don't remember those negative, failures, so to speak, but you definitely remember when a guy hits a 3-run double or a walk-off home run or whatever. So is it just our perception? Do we just remember the things that we think of as being clutch, but we forget the things that are not clutch? So does it all offset? Does it all balance out? What's a clutch situation? Is it runners in scoring position? Is it when there's 2 outs? Maybe you're in the playoffs versus the regular season. Maybe it's just a late inning situation versus early in the game. Maybe you're injured and you're fighting through injury. What's more clutch? Is it more clutch to be in a 2-out situation, or is it more clutch to be in the 9th inning with no outs? Is there such a thing as more clutch? So you kind of have to figure out for yourself what you think clutch is. But I think everybody could agree that runners in scoring position is a more clutch situation than nobody on, right? So if you come up in whatever inning, could be the 1st inning, it could be the 9th inning. If there's nobody on, versus if there's runners in scoring position, 2nd or 3rd, I think most people would agree that's a clutch situation. If you come through in that situation, that could be considered clutch. I don't think anybody who thinks that there is such a thing as clutch would say that that's not a clutch situation. So, for the purposes of what I started looking into, I went with runners in scoring position for some of these hitters. So I wanted to kind of think about who do I think is clutch, or maybe who do a lot of fans think is clutch. I think there's certain names that come to mind. Derek Jeter, Mr. Clutch. Big Papi, David Ortiz. I think most people would consider Albert Pujols clutch, especially during his time here in St. Louis. David Freese has had several clutch situations and some monumental moments, as we have discussed in the past. Jeff Suppan, a lot of people maybe forgot about him, but I think he was considered a clutch playoff pitcher when he was here. We'll get into that. Is that true or not? And I think Chris Carpenter, one of St. Louis's most beloved pitchers, most people would consider him to be clutch. So let's look at each one of these situations and figure out, were they not? Now, I didn't look at any of their numbers before I chose these names. I didn't pick some guys and then look at their numbers and go, oh, they're not clutch, I better leave them out. So these are the first 6 names I came up with, and I decided to look at their stats for better or worse. So This is not all-inclusive by any means. I didn't look up every single statistic or every single situation. It's very difficult to do that. It's hard to find all these stats in one place, and it's kind of hard to decide, what you consider to be a stat that matters. So, like I said, this isn't inclusive, but hopefully it gives you a good idea of whether or not this player did anything better or worse in certain situations. So let's dig in a little bit. First, I'm going to take a look at Derek Jeter. Now, for his career, Jeter had a 310 average and an 817 OPS. So really good numbers, 310 average for his career. Now, the site I was looking at, for whatever reason, only went back to the year 2000 for runners in scoring position. Jeter obviously had some playoff seasons before that, but for whatever reason, this only went back to 2000. So from 2000 through 2012, the regular season runners in scoring position, he batted .306 with an .820 on base percentage. So 310 normal for his career, .306 with runners in scoring position, nearly identical. 817 OPS versus 820 OPS, so nearly identical OPS with runners in scoring position in the regular season. So regular season, clutch situation, so to speak, with runners scoring position, nearly the same numbers. Now, those same seasons, 2000 through 2012 postseason numbers, he batted .233 with a 690 OPS. So this is, again, runners in scoring position. So quite a bit lower numbers. This is postseason. Now, total for the postseason, he batted .308 with an 838 OPS. So nearly identical batting average, nearly identical, a little bit higher OPS total in the postseason. And that's in 33 series, so many series to judge from, a large sample size. But in those postseasons, I guess he batted better with runners nobody on or runners on first than runners in scoring position. So a significant drop off, 233 to 690. But overall, I kind of was trying to decide whether or not they were clutch. So I literally wrote down clutch or not clutch. Now, for Jeter, I wrote not clutch. But in a good sense, it's because his numbers were always good. So he didn't necessarily perform better in clutch situations. He performed as good as he always did, which was good to begin with. So he was just good. But I didn't look at that as clutch. Now, some guys might consider that to be clutch, that not performing worse in high stress situations or potentially against better pitchers or better defenders, doing what you've always done is clutch. There are guys who kind of fold under pressure, or when they are facing tougher pitching, they don't always come through with as high an average. Or when the defense that they're facing is better, they aren't, hitting one through the gaps or whatever. So you might have a very good player who doesn't play as well in the playoffs because he's facing tougher competition. In Jeter's case, his numbers are pretty much the same, and some people would consider that to be clutch. So I combined it with the fact that his postseason runners in scoring position numbers were a little lower, and the fact that overall his numbers stayed about the same over a course of a long sample size. I consider that to be not clutch. So Derek Jeter, not clutch. Still really good. Still all-time great. Not clutch. Let's take a look at David Ortiz, Big Papi. So his numbers are kind of interesting. He's got some big swings. No pun intended. So for his career, his batting average is .286 and his OPS is .931. Again, really good numbers. Let's see, I broke this down a little bit differently for him. I picked and chose a particular postseason, the 2013 postseason, which, as you might recall, is when the Red Sox and Cardinals faced each other again. But his playoff seasons, so I took all the seasons, regular seasons where the Red Sox made the playoffs, his runners in scoring position average in those seasons was .314. So again, for his career, his batting average was .286. In those particular seasons where that team made the playoffs, he batted .314. Now, in those actual postseasons, 314 with runners in scoring position. In those postseasons with runners in scoring position, he batted .326. So again, 314 in the regular season, runners in scoring position. .326 in the postseason, runners in scoring position. So already a higher average with runners in scoring position, and then in the playoffs, runners in scoring position even higher. So that would seem to be clutch, right? Now, let's look at specifically the 2013 postseason, which is when he killed the Cardinals. During that whole postseason, his average was .353, so even higher yet, with a 1.206 OPS. Crazy numbers. That was in 51 at-bats, and he had 16 walks. Now, that was the postseason total. Now, the 13 postseason runners in scoring position, however, he only batted .188 average with an .854 OPS, compared to the 1.206 OPS total. So you could say, even though he had these crazy good numbers in the 2013 postseason with runners in scoring position, he actually didn't have as good of numbers, just a 188 average. Now, that was in 16 at-bats, and he did have 7 walks. So he was still contributing, just not in the same way as his numbers total would indicate. Now, in the 13 World Series alone, he batted, this is against the Cardinals, he batted .688 average with a 1.948 OPS. That's just insane. Should not have happened. I cannot believe they pitched to him as much as they did. That was 25 plate appearances with 8 walks and 16 at-bats. He had 2 home runs, 6 RBI, and only 1 strikeout in 25 plate appearances. So he killed us in the World Series, the 2013 World Series. Again, a .688 batting average. So with Big Papi, those numbers, again, are kind of all over the place, but I would say definitely clutch. Now, again, his runners in scoring position in that one series, postseason 2013, was down, but everything else, his playoff postseason runners in scoring position, his average was .326 compared to a career of .286, and killed us in the World Series. Crazy total 2013 postseason. So I'm going to say clutch, sort of. Really good in some cases, not so good in others, but overall significantly bumped his numbers up in postseason and runners in scoring position in particular. So, Big Papi, clutch. Now, let's take a look at David Freese. He's another kind of interesting case. So, hometown hero here in St. Louis, right? Everybody kind of knows what he did in the 2011 World Series. But, you know, we kind of forget some of the things he did maybe in the NLCS before that, or in the 2012 season after the 2011 World Series. He was still this great player, great contributor for the Cardinals. But for his career, he's only got a .275 average and a .764 OPS total. Now, that's not just in St. Louis. That's his everywhere he's played. .275 average, .764 OPS. Now, in the 2018 regular season, this past year, he batted .296 with an .830 OPS. So I bring that up because he was in the playoffs just this last year with the Dodgers. He was traded partway through the season from the Pirates to the Dodgers. So I wanted to point out, just for that year, he had a significantly higher average and OPS than he has for his career. Now, in that 2018 playoffs, he batted .363 with a 1.083 OPS. And for the record, during each round of the playoffs in 2018, his slugging and OPS improved each series. So total, his averages and OPS were significantly higher than his regular season numbers, and throughout the playoffs, he increased them each series. So that's great. Now, in the 18 playoffs with runners in scoring position, he batted .250 with a .583 OPS. Now, that was only four at-bats, and he had no walks. So, small sample size with runners in scoring position, but it is what it is. So, he batted much better overall in the playoffs, but with runners in scoring position, he was 1 for 4. Now, let's look at the 2011 season. Obviously, the famous season and playoffs and World Series that we all love him for. But in the 2011 regular season, Freese batted .297. So again, this past season in the regular, he was .296. That season, he was .297. So again, that whole season was a step up from his career average of .275. But his OPS that season was only .791, which is a little bit higher than his career total. Now, in the playoffs, he went from .297 in the regular season to .396 in the playoffs. A huge jump in his batting average and 1.228 OPS. So a huge jump in OPS. And then we look at the 11 playoffs runners in scoring position, and it's even bigger jump at .474 average, 1.67 OPS. That's 19 at-bats with 4 walks. So a large enough sample size to get a good feel for it. So from the regular season to the playoffs with runners in scoring position, his numbers keep getting better and better and better. And of course, we all know what he did in Game 6 with the game-tying triple and the walk-off home run, about as clutch as you can get. So, David Freese, definitely clutch. Now, that's limited. I only picked out a few series this particular season because they just made the playoffs, and the 11 series or playoffs because obviously. So, I didn't look at any other series. I didn't look at any other particular situations, but definitely he showed that he improved his numbers in pressure situations. Now, I have a couple pitchers on here, and we still have Albert. Now, with Albert, I didn't look at runners in scoring position. I looked at bases loaded. And the reason I did that is, for whatever reason, over the years when Albert was in St. Louis, I kind of always had this impression of, I've said it feels like every time he comes up with the bases loaded, he hits a grand slam. Now, obviously, that's not true, but it felt like he did it more often than most, or fairly often. It just felt like when he had the bases loaded, you just had this feeling he was going to hit a home run. And I swear there were times where I'd call it, I'd home run and boom, he'd hit one. So I wanted to kind of take a look at, well, what did he do with the bases loaded? So I only looked at his St. Louis seasons. I didn't look at anything in Anaheim. He's been obviously tailing off for years now. So I just really wanted to look at his time in St. Louis when he was the megastar that was Albert Pujols. So during his time in St. Louis, his batting average was .328 and his OPS was 1.037. Really, really good numbers, right? .328, 1.037. Now, with bases loaded, he batted .386. So .328 to .386. So that's a significant jump, almost 60 point increase in batting average. Not huge, but decent. But could you say, well, okay, the bases were loaded. He's likely seeing better pitches. They're not as likely to, throw him a slider away to walk him and walk a run in. So he's going to see more strikes. So is that going to factor in? Definitely it factors in. It's hard to quantify that to know how it factors in. But I did want to look at his home run totals. Let's see. I have a spreadsheet up here that I took some notes on. But in the regular seasons, he only actually had one playoff appearance with bases loaded. I believe that was 2002. And he did get a hit. He was 1 for 1 with a 1,000 average. So I didn't really include that in any of these numbers. But he had 127 at-bats throughout his time in St. Louis with the bases loaded, 49 hits, 12 home runs. So that was his .386 average. I wanted to see, well, it seems like about a 10% home run per at-bat ratio. So, and it is, it's about 10%. And per hit, so 49 hits, 12 of them were home runs. So about a 25% home run per hit ratio, which seemed pretty good to me. Well, then I looked at his career stats in St. Louis, and he had 6,312 at-bats, 2,073 hits, 445 home runs, for about a 7% home run to at-bat ratio. Again, 10% home run to at-bat with the bases loaded to 7% home run per at-bat normally, and 21% home run to hit ratio throughout his career in St. Louis versus 25% home run to hit ratio with the bases loaded. So a little bit better percentages on home runs per at-bat and home runs per hit with the bases loaded. Now, could you say, well, that's, again, because he's seeing better pitches, he's likely seeing more strikes because there's runners on, the bases are loaded, so they're not as likely to walk him. I think that probably is the case and probably accounts for the uptick in those percentages in that ratio. So, still though, really good. Even if you do account for that situation that that he's probably seeing better pitches, it does mean he's doing what he always did. He's always getting these hits. He was always getting these home runs, and he had a higher average, 386 versus 328, to show for it. Is that clutch? I'm going to say it's clutch-ish. He, kind of like Jeter, you would say his numbers are about the same, but in reality, they're better. But because it was a little different than just runners in scoring position, there was maybe no open base. Well, definitely no open base in the case of bases loaded. So, again, I think it's likely he was seeing some better pitches, so his numbers are better. So I'm going to say clutch-ish with that asterisk, so to speak. All right, so let's look at a couple of these pitchers. In a lot of people's minds, no one would equate these two pitchers as equal or similar, Jeff Suppan and Chris Carpenter. But definitely for that short stretch there, Suppan was considered a clutch playoff pitcher. I would say kind of a mediocre regular season pitcher, above average, but not an ace or anything like that. But he kind of had that stretch. He was the 2006 NLCS MVP. He started 2 games, was 1-0. He had some really good numbers in that series, NLCS. But let's look. So for his career, Jeff Suppan had an ERA of 4.70. His WHIP, walks plus hits per inning pitched, was 1.461. His home runs per 9 was 1.2, and his strikeouts per 9 was 4.9. So decent numbers, but nothing to brag about necessarily. Those are his career numbers. Now, again, since we're really just looking at his time in St. Louis, which was better, that's kind of how he got that contract with the Brewers, because he had decent numbers here and sort of tailed off with Milwaukee. So his St. Louis numbers, his ERA was 3.94. His WHIP was 1.411, just barely better. Home runs per 9 was 1.1, and strikeouts per 9 was 5.1. So let's just look at that. 3.94 ERA, 1.411 WHIP. Now, his postseason numbers are a 3.63 ERA, so about 0.3 better, and a 1.228 WHIP, so a little less than 0.2 better. His home runs per 9 in St. Louis was 1.1, but in the postseason it's 1.4, so a little slight uptick in home runs in the postseason, allowed, again, that is. And then strikeouts per 9 was 5.7 in the postseason versus 5.1 regular season. So a little bit of an uptick in home runs allowed, but also a little bit of an uptick in strikeouts, maybe offsets. His ERA was a little bit lower, about 3.3 lower. So, was he better in the postseason? Yes, a little. He was arguably facing tougher competition, so the fact that he was a little bit better is an even better thing. But overall, if you look at, again, it's a pretty small sample size for him in the playoffs. I think it was only like 4 series. Let's see if I can go back to that. He had 8 series. Over the course of 4 seasons, there were 8 series. His total record was 3-4. So, it's like, well, you hate to look at wins and losses because it's really just about how he did with his ERA. And but a 3.63 ERA, so he did improve that. But there were some pretty big swings in there. In the World Series, against Detroit. He started one game, 6 innings, gave up 3 earned runs, couple walks, had a home run. So, not terrible, but we did win the game. He didn't get the decision on that. In the 2004 World Series against Boston, he started one game, only 4 2/3 innings, gave up 4 earned runs, a home run, a walk. So not as good. His ERA was 7.7 in that series. The 05 NLCS against Houston, he got the loss, but he only had a 1.8 ERA, 5 innings pitched, only gave up 1 earned run. So, he kind of had these swings where he was really good in one game and then really not good in another. His NLDS in 06, right before being the MVP in the NLCS, he had a 6.23 ERA. So, again, big swings with Suppan. Really good when he's on, really not so good when he's off. For him, I did write overall, I put clutch a little. He's a little bit clutch. The fact that his numbers were a little bit better in the postseason, again, against tougher competition, tells me that he was clutch, but not so much that you would, count on this guy or give him a big 3 or 4 year contract in Milwaukee like he ended up getting, but clutch a little. So the last guy I want to look at is Chris Carpenter. We all love Chris Carpenter. He's that bulldog mentality. I wish we had more pitchers like him. For his career, 3.76 ERA with a 1.276 whip. Now that's counting his time in Toronto before coming to St. Louis. So let's just look at his St. Louis numbers, which is arguably more representative of the pitcher that he was. Even though he had some injuries here, he had some injuries in Toronto that kind of derailed him from getting that start. So anyway, his St. Louis numbers were 3.07 ERA with a 1.125 whip. So good numbers. His home runs per 9 was 0.7 and his strikeouts per 9 was 7.2. So that's Chris Carpenter's time here in St. Louis. Now, during the postseason, he had a 3.00 ERA compared to 3.07 regular and a 1.296 whip compared to 1.125 whip. So almost the same ERA, slightly worse whip. His home runs per 9 was 0.9 instead of 0.7, and his strikeouts per 9 was 5.7 instead of 7.2. So a slight uptick in home runs allowed in the postseason and a little bit of a downward trend in strikeouts per 9 in the postseason. So almost the same in some cases, a little bit worse in others. Again, competition was tougher, but it's clutch. Now, the 2011 NLDS, which for those of you who don't recall, Game 5 NLDS was against the Phillies. That was the Roy Halladay, Chris Carpenter matchup. Very pressure situation. It was an elimination game. Both these pitchers were elite level. Everybody kind of knew offensively, guys were going to have to try to bring it against these pitchers. There probably wasn't going to be much scoring, and as it turned out, there wasn't. Chris Carpenter shut him down in Game 5. So a zero runs allowed, 0 ERA, 0.333 whip. Just an amazing clutch bulldog performance, right? But look at Game 2 in that same series. He was pretty bad. In only 3 innings pitched, he allowed 4 earned runs. It was definitely not a clutch performance in Game 2. But Game 5 was incredible. I'll never forget it. And it's going to, it helps supplant Carpenter as one of the best all-time Cardinals pitchers for me. But, he had his ups and downs that series. Now, the same year, 2011 World Series, he had 3 games started with a 2-0 record. He actually had the lead in the 3rd game that he pitched in, and Octavio Dotel blew the lead, so he didn't get the decision on that one. And I believe he only had 2 earned runs per start. So, and I want to say, I forget, I didn't write it down, but I want to say in each of those starts, he gave up 2 runs in the first inning and then shut him down after that. Maybe there was only 2 starts where he did that, but 2 early runs, and then he buckled down and shut him down the rest of the way. So Is that clutch? I think so. You're in the World Series. You're the ace of the staff. You got 3 starts. He started Game 7, which we won. He, got into a little early trouble, but shut him down, got out of the inning, got out of the trouble, and gave up nothing the rest of the way. To me, that's clutch. And that's one of the things I love about Carpenter is that I feel like he never had those big innings. He never gave up, 6 runs in one inning, which we've seen guys like Wainwright and Carlos. We've seen some of these, what we considered ace pitchers, that still kind of every once in a while they get bombed, they get rocked, they have this horrible outing, they got to come out in the third. And it always just felt like Carpenter never really had those types of outings. He was always, even if he got into trouble, he was able to pitch out of it, only give up 2 or 3 runs or whatever instead of 4 or 5 or 6. So now that being said, I wrote down next to Chris Carpenter, not clutch. But again, for the same reason as Jeter, because his numbers were essentially the same. ERA was the same. WHIP only went up just barely. Home runs allowed only went up just barely. Strikeouts per 9 went down just a little bit. And for the great outing that he had in Game 5, he had a so-so outing in Game 2 of the NLDS. Arguably was clutch in the World Series, but he did give up a couple runs in each of those games. So again, his numbers just kind of stayed the same with his career totals. He was always kind of known for giving up, 1 run here, 2 runs there, and getting out of it and getting the win, which is what he did in the World Series. So I wrote down not clutch because his numbers are the same. So what can we take away from that? We've got Jeter, not clutch. Big Papi, clutch, sort of. David Freese, clutch. Albert Pujols, clutch-ish. Jeff Suppan, clutch, a little. Chris Carpenter, not clutch, because they're the same. Some of these are bigger sample sizes than others. How big of a sample size do you need? If you extrapolate these situations out over the long haul, would you just see the same numbers? Well, in some cases you do. In Carpenter's case, in Jeter's case, I think in David Freese's case, you definitely see a larger trend towards clutch performance. Are there more extenuating circumstances behind that? Maybe, probably. There are some studies that show, if you really look at the sabermetrics and the analytics, that clutch hitting is not perceptibly repeatable. So it's hard to argue that there aren't certain situations where a player has performed clutch or performed well in that situation. But to say that it's repeatable, that I can do this every time I come in or at a higher percentage, it's hard to quantify that. And a lot of studies have shown that that's not the case. And some studies have shown that even when it is an improvement, that statistically you're better off. Like, let's say you wanted to put a certain player in an at-bat because he's clutch. Okay, we've got this guy, bases are loaded or there's 2 on. We're going to bring this guy in maybe off the bench or something. Or even if just he happens to be coming up, that the difference in his clutch ability is less of a factor than even just playing a righty-lefty matchup. So if you said, well, we've got this guy off the bench who's left-handed, we got a right-handed pitcher in, they're not going to the pen to bring in a lefty, so let's bring in the left-hander off the bench. That righty-lefty matchup for that hitter is a better factor than it would be going off of someone's clutch abilities. So that's kind of how small the difference is in clutch performance, according to some studies. Now, maybe that's considering everybody, and I'm not talking about everybody. I'm talking about the guys who are clutch. So it's hard to say whether or not these studies are looking at the things that we think of when we think of clutch players. It's hard to say what is clutch, who is clutch. Is it a real thing? Do you perceive it? I think most fans do perceive it. Most people think there are certain guys who are clutch. Now, to a certain extent, every one of these big leaguers is clutch. Guys don't get to the big leagues without being able to handle pressure situations and perform well. But that being said, no one's implying that all baseball players, all major league players are alike in ability. There clearly are some players that are better than others. So to say that they're all clutch is a little misleading. So you could say they're all clutch compared to their high school teammates, or they're all clutch compared to their college teammates, or all of these guys are clutch compared to the guys that didn't make it out of single A or double A ball. But for all the guys that are in the big leagues, there are guys who are more clutch than others. So when you talk about, well, they can handle the pressure, well, all of these guys can handle pressure. All of these guys got here by handling pressure. Well, he's able to hit a home run when other guys aren't. Well, they're all able to. Well, maybe not, but these guys all have these abilities. But it's what do you do under pressure? Are there guys that choke under pressure? Absolutely. Are there guys that don't come through in the clutch? For sure. Now, they're only going to get so many chances to do that before they get sent down or cut or whatever. But so maybe that's part of it. The guys who aren't as clutch, we don't see as often. And maybe the guys that are clutch, we see more often, which makes it seem less of a thing because we just see it all the time. I don't know. It's hard to quantify. But I do think it's real. I think it's interesting to see some of these players that I pointed out that kind of everybody thinks is clutch and plays better under certain situations. And yet we find out Jeter and Chris Carpenter performed that well all the time. They didn't really, even in the situations that we think were better, maybe weren't better than normal. Now, you could argue that one game, Game 5 against the Phillies, Carpenter did pitch better. He gave up, no runs. He shut them down. Is that what Carpenter always did? No, he wasn't, a 0 ERA guy. He was a 3.07 ERA guy. So that game was better, was clutch. Is that enough? Is that too small a sample size to count? Same with Jeter. We've all seen a lot of these big moments that he's had. Were they better than he had done normally? I don't know. He kind of always had stuff like that. So that's kind of why I put him down as not clutch. Anyway, I want to know what you guys think. I've talked to some friends who think that there is no such thing as clutch, that guys who are perceived as clutch are just doing what they normally do. And some of these numbers bear that out, like Jeter, like Carpenter. Some of these numbers don't bear that out, like David Freese. So I think it's a real thing. Some guys think it's not. There's way more numbers that you could look into and analyze than I did here. And maybe I'll do that again sometime in the future. Maybe I'll pick one player and kind of dig even deeper into their numbers and really kind of see, was this guy clutch throughout his career or in certain situations? But anyway, I want to know what you think. Let me know. Get on Twitter or Instagram. Definitely follow me on there. I've been posting photos of some of the new players and kind of some interesting captions. Maybe I'll put some stats on there too. But give me a follow on the social media and subscribe to the podcast. Definitely get those automatic downloads. You want to have it waiting for you every week. So this was Clutch. Until next time, I'm Jared, and this is the BFIBs Almanac.